This is week 10 of the fall trimester of 2017, the end of the trimester, so this was the last week right before winter break. Right now, I'm actually filming this in a hotel in Portland, and I took off my glasses because this hotel room, it's dark outside and the lights are pretty dim, and there's a lamp about 2 feet from my face, so there's just a huge glare on my glasses. But okay, so getting into the week. So on Monday, working with the figure painting, I know that this is the last week that I have to work on this painting. So I spend the first part of the day just looking at my painting and looking at the model Brian and just making a game plan for what I want to do today, but then also what I want to try and accomplish for the end of the week. And so I'm looking and I'm seeing that my painting is dim and I want to brighten some areas up. So I definitely see in his hair, I want to brighten that up, in his face and his chest, and the bent leg that's catching a lot of the light, I want to brighten that up as well. So I go ahead and I do that, and I'm kind of painting in thin ways, in kind of a more indirect way. So I'm kind of instead of, like for the hair, for instance, instead of painting the whole entire massive hair again, what I'm doing is I'm using paint and kind of using it, almost dry brushing it on. And so it's a more indirect way of painting because it's more dry brushing and letting that layer kind of fuse over the layer on top rather than repainting everything. And so I'm doing that for the hair, the chest, and the face, and the leg. And I'm seeing in different areas how the paint is coming off the brush in really interesting ways. I kind of like the effect in the hair. So there's not a lot of medium in my paint either, but I'm still painting thickly, kind of. I don't know how to describe it because it was pulling off the brush and catching the texture of the canvas, and it was just pulling off the brush in really interesting ways. And I like that in the hair, certain effects that I got. I thought it was interesting in the bent leg, though I don't know if it quite works in that area for the effect of skin there, but it was interesting, so I might play around with painting in that way later. Tuesday, Brian wasn't able to come in that day, so we just had a model come in for the 3 hours to hold one pose for 3 hours, and I did a color study. And I don't do a whole lot of color studies. It's kind of like if a model can't come in that day for the long pose, so I did one this trimester of Dimitri as well, but I'm liking them. They're really fun, and I feel like I'm getting a better sense of color and light in these, and it's just probably just painting experience and doing more of that. I'm liking how they're turning out more. And then Wednesday, Magda came by and gave me a critique, and the first thing that she said was the way that I painted Brian's hair, it looked kind of funny. It was too light, and she said probably too cold of colors that I used. So she was saying that I should darken it and warm it up then. And so what I did to do that is I added more medium into my paint, so I was still painting in an indirect way because I was then started glazing over top, which I don't do a whole lot of glazing, at least glazing in this way. And so that was fun to practice with, and I really liked the effect that I got as well. So what I did was I mixed up something that was warm and a little bit darker than what I had, and then I put a whole bunch of medium beside that mixture and got a little bit of the mixture and mixed it in with my brush. So it was really thin, the mixture then, and then I put it all over the hair, and then I made up other mixtures that some were lighter, some were darker, I think in other spots too. There's a lot of contrast in the hair too because it is getting a lot of light at the top of his head, but then as the hair has like the shadow but around his neck, it's really dark. So there's a lot of contrast that I could play around with. And so what I was doing for the glaze, so I had the initial glaze over all of the hair, and then I made other thin mixtures, and I would go up and put down a paint stroke of that glaze, and I'd step back, and I'd go up and put down a paint stroke and step back. So there was a lot of back and forth from my painting and looking at it from far away and really seeing how each stroke that I made into the glaze affected the whole impression. And I think I got a really cool effect of Brian's hair having all that volume, and it's kind of curly and has these kinks in it. And so that was a lot of fun to do that. So I definitely want to play around with glazing with that more as well. On Thursday, I'm looking at my painting and I'm seeing that everything is pretty evenly done on it, and I like how the painting looks from a distance, but when I get up close to it, I don't find it, I don't like it so much, and I don't think it's that interesting to look up close. So, and I think that's because earlier, or it was last week when the painting I felt like was kind of in this blocking stage where all the edges were really sharp and it had this kind of like cartoony appearance to it, and Magda was saying to like really push your edge quality. So I do have sharps and I do have really soft ones, and so I did that. And the way that I was doing that and bringing the painting more into a resolve was this indirect way of painting where I'm glazing, scumbling, dry brushing stuff on, and using the paint more thinly, so I felt like I had control of it, so I could just really get control of the painting again and move it out of the blocking stage to the resolving stage. But now everything looks, when you step up to it, it looks kind of mushy and not as solid as I want, and not quite the texture of things. So I think the hair looks like the texture of hair because the hair is soft, but I wasn't getting this fleshy appearance that I wanted, and also not, you have like really fleshy parts, and then you have parts like bony parts, and I wasn't getting the looks of those as well. So I was asking Matt what I could do because I have today and tomorrow left, and he was saying that it's good that I have everything caught up in the stage that I have it, but then to push it farther, what I can do is focus on the focal areas, so the face, the chest, and the hand that is that's up. And he was saying, so example for the chest, to mix up all those colors that I have in the chest and just repaint the chest and paint it in a very direct way where I'm painting wet into wet and leaving paint strokes and having paint strokes that are really representing the planes, and to also focus then on edges in between shapes, because it's the edges in between shapes that really make it look like the material that it is. So I could get away from where I'm painting thinner and kind of dry brushing and scumbling, where I can make things kind of look cottony and mushy, painting in more of a direct way, which makes it so I can make more specific edges in between the shapes. Then I can focus on what those edges are to make it actually look like the texture and the material that it is. So like either fleshy skin or more bony landmarks on skin. So I did that, and it definitely started helping to get there to be more of a focal point. It's painted differently, and it does have a more solid appearance to it. And then on Friday, I ended up just doing the same thing, so working on those focal points. And another thing that I'll talk more about when I get into my still life, but I'm trying to find now ways where I can find bigger shapes in areas and just leave them as big shapes, and trying to resolve things, but not meaning that I'm resolving things by just making sure that everything is small and small and small and detailed with all the shapes, but try and find bigger shapes that you can leave them there for more interesting areas to look at in the painting. And there's specifically this one point in Brian where he has his arm raised, and in the shadow there's this really cool big red shape in the arm right there. And so I was trying to paint that, and I was telling Matt what I was doing, and he gave me a little bit of vermilion, and because I don't have that on my palette, and man, that's such a cool color. I've never played around with vermilion before. I think it's by Michael Harding's Genuine Vermilion, and so that color is so fun. It's more opaque than my cadmium red light that I use, and it's also a cooler red. So man, it looked so cool on the figure, so I started putting that everywhere. And I really like how it looks, so I'm gonna have to get myself a tube of it. And then I spent the rest of the day just working on the focal points, like the head, chest, and that hand. And also, I wanted to also make sure that the shadow shapes were looking solid as well. So, especially in the parts that were a little bit too mushy and soft that I wanted to clean up a bit. So, the pits of the arm and the arm that's down, I put in some brush strokes and just leave them there for the shadow shape right there, and also the shadow that's under the stomach, I did the same thing. And all in all, with this painting, I think it's fine. I don't know. Well, if I would have had another week, because I missed a whole week from being in the studio, I think I would have gotten the painting into, I could have pushed all these things with the painting more directly on top of the more indirect way of painting, and then I could have maybe put thin layers on top, and I don't know. I just feel like I guess I ran out of time with this. But I think the biggest thing that I learned with this painting definitely is what Magda was first telling me to, when I'm trying to get out of a block-in stage, to really focus on, make sure you set up your key with edges so you have your sharpest edge and then your softest edge, and then you can work the range in between that. And then also what Matt was saying before, which if I am painting kind of thin and mushing paint around, that's not bad, because I can get control of the painting that way and make sure that I'm getting accurate values, drawing, and color. But then I can push it further with repainting areas once I've found all of those elements in a more direct wet into wet way. And now for my still life. I finished up my still life this week, really happy about it. So this week I mostly painted on the pot. That was the one thing that I really wanted to, I felt like before it wasn't feeling as solid as it could. I really wanted it to feel like a heavy ceramic glossy pot. And I also worked on the plank of wood, and the top plane of the plank of the wood, which the pot and the garlic sit on. I unified that a little bit. The front part of the plank, where it has all those chipped pieces, Matt talked to me about it and was saying that it's nice that I do have a different texture to represent the chunky part of the wood, and I did that with, I painted that with a palette knife, and he said though that it could be more sophisticated than what I had, because having everything that's painted, even though it's painted differently than how I painted the garlics or the rug or the pot, it would be better and more interesting to have more variation in that line that goes across the painting, especially since that plank of wood, the front part, is a horizontal line that goes across the painting. So to have it painted in the same way, that is kind of a texture, since it's more thickly painted because it is painted with a palette knife. It just kind of gives this like boring or cheesy element if it's just like this line that's going across it. So then he was showing me different ways that I can break that up. So having elements that are the palette knife, but also how I can get the same effect of that, but kind of more interestingly by mixing in ways to paint it with a brush. And then also another thing that I thought was really cool that I took away from that was, so when I was painting with a palette knife, I feel like the paint will come off of the palette knife in really unpredictable ways as it catches either the texture of paint that's under it or the texture of the canvas. And so it is kind of random, which is definitely nice, but Matt was saying that it looks, to make it look like it's intentionally the object that it is, that if there is this randomness to like crumbly paint coming off of a palette knife or something, that it looks nice if you have like a really definitive solid brush stroke down by it, so it gives it more solidity. So I was doing all that I could with this painting, and I have it in my studio that's next to the actual setup of it, but I would take the painting out into different parts of the studio that was in different lighting situations, so I could make sure that I liked it in all different situations. Also, something that Magda told me with my last cast painting that I did is she said that to think about the painting like if I were to cut it up into little squares, and the little squares of that still life painting, that was all that there was of that painting, that everything about it should be interesting in and of itself. So I'm looking at everything and trying to be really critical of kind of every brushstroke that I'm putting down, so everything in the painting looks interesting, and there's like your eyes can travel around it, and hopefully that the painting still keeps giving back all the way through the painting and not just the focal point of it. And I would also, when I would take it out, or even when it was in my studio, I would ask other students to come up and tell me what they thought about stuff. And I was asking a lot about, this last week was a lot about the pot and the top part of the pot where it's receiving a lot of light, where there's dust on it, and I wanted to make sure that it looked solid and heavy and like you could knock on it and it would feel like a hard ceramic pot. So it was really helpful to have a lot of other eyes on it, because I am looking at it for so long, that they have more fresh eyes than I do on it. And and also because I've been staring at the actual setup and then my painting, so things make more sense to me with how the pot actually looks. But I want to make sure that I'm not just representing how something actually, or how I'm not just representing the setup for what the setup is, but I want to make sure that it looks good as a painting in and of itself. So there are certain elements, like in the top part of the pot where there is all that dust, there's this imperfection in the pot where it's indented, and the glaze, that red glaze, doesn't go into that area as deep, so it kind of has this more gray appearance to it. And so I was asking people what they thought that was and making sure that it made sense, and they said that it didn't. I'd take it back into the studio and see what I could do so it made sense. And so I just kept taking it out and asking people, and really listening to what they were saying, what I could do to improve it, or if they just said like, well, I feel like this one area could look more three-dimensional, then I would take it back and try and figure out why and repaint it. And so I repainted the top of the top of the pot so many times, but I finally got everything finished to, I felt like, as good as I can get it, and there was nothing else that I could do. I felt like it was every element was how I wanted it to be, and as well painted as I possibly could. And then so I asked Matt to give it one last critique, and the one thing that he said was it looked like that even though I had painted all these different elements in the painting in different ways, like the rug, the pot, the wood, the garlics, that it looked like the way that I had painted it, or the shapes in each of them, like the size of them, were all the same. So kind of like I'd broken up every element of the painting, kind of using the same size brush to paint it all. And him saying that really opened my eyes to that. I guess I never really considered that before, that can bring another level of interest to a painting, is making sure that you have different variation, not just how you paint, but different variation of size, of shape, and brush stroke. So I definitely use a huge variation of brushes when I make a painting. I usually start off with the biggest brushes that I have, and then as the painting is getting closer to the end and I'm resolving it more, the brushes get smaller and smaller. So I'm like trying to get everything in as big of planes as possible, how I start off, and then as I go along, I just keep breaking up those planes into smaller and smaller and smaller planes. But I think then with what Matt was saying, and really clicked with me then, is that Just because you're resolving something doesn't mean that you have to make all these tiny little plane changes and all these tiny little details, because that doesn't necessarily make the painting interesting just because there's all these little small things all over the canvas. But I think it would be nice to have a lot of variation in size of shapes, and if I could keep some things really extremely simple with bigger brushstrokes, I think that would look really, really nice. And so I took my painting back and I repainted areas of the top of the pot again for the 100th time. And I found that really tricky for me to be able to do that, to try and find these bigger areas. I think it's easier for me to get things to be smaller shapes and smaller planes. So I did find some ways that I could get bigger brush strokes. And so the top part of the pot where there's all that dust, where the strongest, biggest highlight is, I took that highlight and it looks, or I hope it looks like one brush stroke, though it took quite a few to get it to kind of look like one brush stroke as it drags across to the right of the pot, as it's like a bright highlight, and then it gets a little bit dimmer as it's going to hit the like decorative handle part of the pot. So I did that, and I think that it improved it a lot, and it gave it more interest definitely in that area. So that was a huge thing to learn, and I think that's another thing that I really want to try and focus on. So for my paintings, when I establish a key, I'm thinking of the drawing structure, the value structure, temperature structure, color structure, painting technique structure with like different elements of how you can be using texture and how you're applying paint. But now also, and then also edges for soft and sharp edges. And now I think that's something that I want to start studying in other people's paintings and see how I can apply that to mine, is the different sizes of brush strokes and how and where you can use them to get even more interest into your painting. All right, and then lastly, for extras in the week, Tuesday evening drawing, we had a model come in, and we started off with a standing pose. She ended up getting dizzy, and so we didn't want her to be uncomfortable or end up hurting herself in any way. So halfway through, we switched her to a seated pose. And then I worked one more day on the portrait that I've been working on with Dimitri, and so this day I started blocking in the colors and more trying to get the values more in. I think I get one more day to work on this, though I'm not certain, so I'm just going to see how far I can push it with the time that I got with him. And then I did another portrait of Ivana with charcoal and white chalk. And finally on Friday we had final critique, which I'll make a separate video on my final critique and what my instructors and I talked about, so this video doesn't get ridiculously long.